Welcome everyone to the Fermentation Association's webinar of Retail Sales Trends for Fermented Food and Beverage. I'm Amelia Nielsen-Stoll, editor of TFA. We are a trade group that was launched to support producers who use fermentation to create delicious and often healthful food and beverages. Our goals are to help educate consumers about fermentation and its benefits, support scientific research into those health benefits, and work with food safety authorities to establish clearer and more appropriate regulations in regards to fermentation. Today, we bring you two great speakers, Perteet Spencer, Vice President of Strategic Solutions at Spins, and Alex Lewin, author and TFA Advisory Board member. We have many questions already submitted and reviewed with our speakers. If there are additional topics you'd like to see addressed, please enter them in the chat below and we will try to get to them. We'd also like to thank today's sponsors, Lee Kum Kee, a leading manufacturer of Asian sauces and ingredients since 1888, and Spins, a wellness-focused data technology company. All right, Alex and Perteet, take it away.
Thanks, Amelia. I will start off by talking a little bit about how we got here, I guess. The goals for the Fermentation Association today, as representing fermented food producers, are we'd like to continue to get a handle on the size of the market for fermented foods and beverages, and to see what the trends are like, you know, by product type, by channel, and by seasonality. So we approached Spins as the leading tracker of sales in natural foods in the relevant channels, and we partnered with them to see what we could learn and how we could look at their sales database from different angles. There's some judgment in it. We looked at their product categories and identified the ones that looked fermented, like things like shelf-stable pickles may have been fermented, but maybe they're pasteurized. So fermented category has sort of the edges of it are a little blurry sometimes. But we wanted to find the ones where the dominant portion of the category is fermented. And we looked at the data, and then there were some big things in the data that prevented us from seeing some of the smaller things where there's more change in the category. So like wine, beer, and cheese are fermented, but they're so giant that including them would make it impossible to identify trends in smaller categories. Plus, wine, beer, and cheese are outside the main scope of the Fermentation Association because they're already well represented by other organizations of various sorts. So we broke down some categories like alcoholic beverages, non-wine and beer, then non-alcoholic beverages, just a little bit, and then yogurt, dairy and non-dairy, refrigerated and frozen, then condiments and pickled vegetables, then tempeh, then sauces, and then miso in its own category. Then we ran into some more problems. The hard cider and mead category is sort of more like everything that's not wine and beer, including hard seltzer. And hard seltzer has become so big just in the last couple of years that it overwhelms the other smaller categories. And then hard kombucha is in the beer category, and it's still a little bit hard to tease it out from beer in terms of the cash register numbers. So then yogurt is, 8 billion plus in refrigerated products. So that sort of is big enough to dwarf other things. So we reproduce our fermented landscape into yogurt, non-alcoholic beverages, sake, pickles and condiments, tempeh, sauces, and then miso and related. And so as you'll see, we have interesting numbers for all of those. And then we did things like comparing refrigerated kimchi and sauerkraut to the shelf-stable versions. And this is our first take on some of this in this particular way. So as time goes on, we will be refining some of these categories and figuring out the best ways to look at these things so that we can learn from them. And new categories will be coming up too, like hard kombucha, which we mentioned, which is, didn't exist a few years ago, and it's definitely on the rise now. And I predict in a year or two, it's going to be a much more broadly known category. So with that, we can hand it over to the SPINS data and Perteet. So Perteet Spencer from SPINS, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction. So excited to be here to talk a bit more about the fermented foods landscape. We've got a lot of really great content with you here today. But before I dig into some of the specifics around the categories, I want to give everyone some context for kind of where SPINS is getting our data, how we've structured the landscape in broad strokes, and then we'll dig in. Our agenda for today, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so please continue to put questions in the chat as you have them, and we'll be sure to get to those. But we're going to kick off with kind of a quick introduction to SPINS and our joint view with the Fermented Association around the landscape. We'll dig in starting at that 20,000 foot view on the total fermented landscape, and then do a deeper dive into some key focus segments so that you get some really deep insight that you can take away from this. So kind of a broad view of SPINS, if you're not familiar with us. We've been around for about 25 years now and have really evolved to be the common language for the health and wellness industry. And so that's our logo in the center there. We really think of ourselves as a connector across many of these different groups. And so as you think about the landscape that we cover, retailers, brands, distributors, investors, brokers, they're all leaning on SPINS to really develop a common language for the health and wellness industry. We're unique in three ways, which I think are particularly important for this conversation. The first is our retail coverage. And as we talked about at the top of the call, this call will be kind of focused on the retail landscape. For context, I know this came up as a part of some of our pre-calls. We estimate this is generally about 50% of the total market. So we're not going to be talking about pharma or food service here, but really brick and mortar retail in the US. But what's unique about SPINS' view of this marketplace is we're able to look at it across channels. And so we'll dig into what we're seeing in conventional. That's also referenced as MULO or multi-outlet at different points in the deck. So you have that as a reference point. We're able to see the conventional landscape through a strategic partnership that we have with IRI. And then we have a number of exclusive channels that are only available at SPINS. And so we'll be giving you kind of some highlights of our natural enhanced channel. Now this channel, particularly in this space, is really important because it gives us early visibility to some of the disruptor brands of the future. So excited to share those insights with you as well. The second kind of key differentiator of SPINS is our product intelligence capability. And so we'll dig into that in a bit, but this is really the capability that we use to be able to slice and dice the market to get to our shared view of the fermented landscape. And then lastly, our applications, which are really geared at translating insights into action by making all of these trillions of rows of data really easy to understand and act on. So I touched on briefly the unique view of the landscape. You'll see we're going to talk a lot about MULO today, or conventional retailers. That's really critical to scale for brands. And within that conventional landscape, we're talking about classes of trade that include mass, grocery, club, convenience, and dollar. And then on the left-hand side, we'll talk about innovation channels, primarily with a focus on natural enhanced for today. Natural Enhance is critical in helping us understand the behaviors of progressive shoppers. And you'll see pretty quickly the brand composition from MULO to Natural Enhance looks quite different. And so getting this complete view of the landscape is a real asset to our partners. I talked about how we'll use attributes to really identify the market. The attribute that we'll tap in the most today is the product type attribute, but know that we drill down all the way to the ingredient level to tease out insights of what's disrupting, what is driving growth in the marketplace. So on to our view of fermented. We looked across the 60 plus spins categories and honed in on 10 categories, which we would term fermented product categories. There are 57 product types, so a really robust view of the market, and we've included some example brands on the right. We're excited about the growth potential for fermented foods. And so while fermented foods represent about 1.4% of the market today, there are segments that are tracking well above the growth of food and beverage that are poised for disruption in the future. Across total food and beverage, you're seeing growth of about 11% in the last 4 weeks, 12% in the last 52 weeks, which is slightly lower than the growth that we see of natural products, which are upticking just a couple of points at 13 and 14% respectively. You can see in total that the fermented growth has stayed steady and over the last year at about 4% growth. And, you know, frankly, that can be a bit misleading as you think about kind of performance relative to the total market. As Alex mentioned earlier, a big chunk of that, what's driving that 4% is a bit of a lower growth rate in yogurt. We're seeing explosive growth well beyond even 13 and 14% in some of the other segments. So that gives us excitement that there is a ton of opportunity to scale and continue to increase the footprint of these products. And so let's go ahead and dig into it. So as we look at our total fermented landscape, and again, this is excluding the total beer category. We have included sake within this space. The market has reached about $9.2 billion in sales in the last year. That's an acceleration of about 4 points of growth. And you can see the compound annual growth rate across channels. And you'll see that, interestingly enough, while convenience is small, it's been one of the big contributors of growth to fermented products. And then MULO, or conventional retail, has also been a contributor of growth. Natural enhanced channel has started to flatten out a bit. And that's really driven by a bit of a slowdown in kombucha. And so we'll get into that in a bit. Now, as you look at the composition of that roughly $16 billion market, you can see it's largely led by yogurt, with about 83% of the sales today growing at a rate of 2.8%. As I mentioned before, what's most exciting about this space is you can see there's explosive growth in some of the emerging segments like sauces, miso, and plant-based meat alternatives, which include things like natto and tempeh. So if we peel yogurt out of that $16 billion market, we see that growth acceleration. So over the last year, we saw an acceleration of 6 points to reach 12% growth in nearly $2 billion in sales. And again, convenience is kind of holding its own in the space with a 26% CAGR off of a small base, and steady growth happening in multi-outlet or conventional channel at about 12% over the last 2 years. Once you take yogurt out, you can see non-alcoholic beverages really shines. That's driven in large part by kombucha, and that's about 51% of the total market. But you're also seeing, sauces, pickled and fermented vegetables drive strong growth and be strong contributors to the size of this market. Now we're in an anomaly year, so I'm sure there's a lot of questions about the pandemic and how the pandemic has affected these categories. And so as you tease out our kind of volume tiers, you'll see that yogurt actually hit a recent low. So this is a trended sales view over the last 2 years. You'll see yogurt kind of hit a 2-year low in January. And the pandemic actually restored a bit of growth to the space. And so we saw a pretty dramatic uptick in March. And we've now kind of reached a higher baseline of volume kind of coming out of the pandemic. And I'd say as you look at total food and beverage, this trend of big volume spike in March coupled with a bit of flattening is pretty consistent across many categories. I do think what's encouraging is the fact that we're now above the average indicates that we're getting some kind of renewed focus and traction in this space. Now we apply the same approach to sauces, shelf-stable pickles, and fermented beverages and non-alcoholic beverages. And you're seeing that similar to yogurt, sales of these categories have kind of peaked in March and then have started to settle at slightly higher baselines coming out of this pandemic period. Now, non-alc beverages is one we'll certainly want to watch. We've seen a slight dip in the last couple of months. We know a lot of that is driven by, again, the slowdown in kombucha that's happening as a result of some of those grab and go occasions kind of diminishing in the landscape we're in today. And so we're seeing many of those brands pivot to larger sizes and multi-packs to really keep that growth healthy. And then lastly, we look at a seasonal view of our plant-based meat alternatives, miso and sake. And what we see here is that while miso and sake appear to be stronger than ever, really experiencing that uptick and then steadily increasing, momentum seems to be waning for tempeh and natto after that uptick in the March pantry load. And my suspicion there is in that same period, you'd have actually seen tremendous adoption of other plant-based meats as those products continue to innovate. So I presume there's some competitive pressure with those segments as the plant-based meat segment in total continues to scale. So as you look at the top brands, this is a view of our top 10 brands and our top 10 growers in the MULO channel. You'll see Chobani, Yoplait, and Dan Enlightened Fit kind of round out the top 10 brands. And that top 10 brand list is largely yogurt centric. What's exciting to see is there's a bit more diversification happening and on the growers or the items that are kind of disrupting the space. And so you see top 10 growers are Chobani, Too Good, and Kikkoman. Now, as I mentioned, the trends in MULO and natural tend to be an indicator where the market is going. And this is no different in the case here where we see kombucha brands play a much more prominent role in the natural enhanced channel. But you also have these really interesting kind of new entrants that are gaining traction with differentiated propositions. So a good example there is Nancy's with their very kind of functional forward yogurts. So let's dig into the segments in a bit more detail, and we will start with yogurt. So while fermented yogurt saw a bit of an acceleration of about 4 points in the last year, we do know that the segment is underperforming versus the total landscape. We've seen convenience channels slow down by about 12% over the last 2 years. And MULO and natural enhance have remained pretty steady at 1% growth over the last 2 years. The yogurt softness is primarily driven by soft performance of the lead segments. So if you look at the pie chart on the left, you'll see that yellow block represents kind of core yogurt, which is growing at a rate of about 1%, or 1.6, almost 2%. And then you have Greek yogurt, another big contributor of growth, which is growing at a 3%. So those two segments combined are about nearly 85% of the category, and really the focal point of that slowdown that we're seeing. What's encouraging is as folks look for kind of sweet treats to disrupt their day, we are seeing really strong growth in some of the frozen segments like bars and pops, and frozen desserts, which is small, but growing at nearly 300%. You know, one of the things we often look at as we compare the channel dynamics is kind of opportunity to disrupt for emerging brands. And this is a segment that surely signals an opportunity for disruption. As you look at many of the kind of legacy brands seeing slowdowns across the market. And then you do see it across both channels. But despite those slowdowns, you do see some brands breaking through and disrupting with kind of new propositions for this space. In non-alcoholic beverages, we saw an interesting kind of dynamic in that we saw a slight acceleration of growth in MULO, but a bit of a slowdown in the natural channel, which is a more significant portion of sales for this space. And so in total, the segment grew about 4% in the last year. And as you think about kind of what is at the heart of that slowdown, you have a lot of really small segments that have suffered and are heavily natural channel leaning, like drinking vinegars, private label drinks, and the refrigerated ciders. Again, those are small, and some of them just did not stick as different, more palatable options kind of entered the market that were more appealing to kind of mainstream consumers. You are seeing kind of kombucha hold this space at about 7.1% growth. But as you unpack kind of where that growth is coming from, it's largely attributable to multi-outlet distribution gains as natural enhance starts to slow down a bit. So looking at the top performing brands across non-alcoholic beverages, you're seeing that they're largely dominated by kombucha brands. You are seeing that while there is a general slowdown across many brands, as I mentioned, some regional kombucha brands like Health-Ade and Hum have been able to really drive strong growth and really carry the broader softness of this set. So what's happening in pickles and fermented beverages? Well, this is a space that's seen pretty explosive uptick in growth over the last year. And so we saw about a 12-point acceleration with really strong growth across every single channel. And this growth is led by kimchi, which is about 7% of the market today, but driving 90% of the growth. You're also seeing strong growth happening in pickles, slices, and spears, which are other significant categories for this space. this is a category full of disruption. And so you're seeing the fastest growth come from emerging non-pickle brands. So brands like Nasoya, the plus means over 1,000% growth. Cleveland Kraut and Sunjas are driving significant growth and really disrupting this space. And then you have kind of new pickle brands emerging, so core or kind of format that are also contributing to strong growth here. So if we thought we saw a significant uptick in growth in the fermented vegetable space, we saw an even larger acceleration happening in fermented sauces over the past year, with 24% growth, a 19% acceleration over the last year, driven in large part by strong momentum in the MULO channel. This market growth is led by the largest segment, soy sauce, but we're also seeing some emerging spaces like gochujang and fish sauce lead the way in terms of high double-digit growth. As you'll see across the top 10 brands, both in MULO and natural, this is really a highly fragmented space. So the propositions are really different by channel, indicating or elevating the importance of understanding these channel dynamics. Both Kikkoman and Sanjay saw really strong growth across both channels. And then closing out with sake, plant-based meat alternatives, and miso. These emerging segments are seeing high growth, with all accelerating over the last year. We've got plant-based meat alternatives up by 20 points, miso up by 15 points. All of these driving combined growth by about 75 million in 2020. As you look at the top landscape here, you're seeing the top 3 brands by our different segments: sake, plant-based meat alternatives, and miso. On the left is your MULO channel. On the right is your natural enhanced channel. Lots of positive growth numbers here, but you can see the brand landscape is pretty fragmented, particularly in miso, where the composition or top contributors or the top brands look completely different by channel. So what are some considerations for brands to think about in this space? Well, overall, we're seeing historically small segments gaining traction in the marketplace. How are you scaling and innovating in your portfolio to capture some of these new growth opportunities that are set to pave the way for the future of growth in fermented? The pandemic has brought a renewed consumer focus on the fermented space. Are you looking at what the new consumers are who have come into your brand, how their behavior is changing, and how you'll adapt to keep this new base engaged? Lastly, channel dynamics really highlight the different propositions fueling growth in innovation channels. How are you managing this evolving bifurcated channel landscape to ensure you're staying ahead of where the market is going? Know that Spence is here as a resource to help you navigate all of these challenges, and we're happy to support you. As I mentioned, I want to be sure to save time for questions, so I'll pause there and open it up to the group.
Perteet, thank you. That was great. Oh wait, my video. I think my video is Amelia, you may need to. Okay, right. There we go. Technology is still not perfect.
It happens to all of us.
Right. That was fascinating, Perteet. I had a couple of questions before we open it up to the questions from the audience. I was surprised to see that Chobani has higher sales than Dannon. I mean, Dannon, which invented the consumer yogurt market whenever it was 70 years ago or something, and now you know, Chobani is more sales. That was interesting to me and surprising. I was surprised and excited to see that kimchi is 7% of the pickled vegetable market, because I'm a fan of kimchi, and it's interesting to me too, because we think of you know, we associate kimchi with Korean food, but clearly it's not a niche vegetable product anymore. It must be selling to a broad audience if it's 7% of the market. I wanted to put in a shout out to Chochikubai, which is, I believe, a Berkeley, California company. So that's my neck of the woods. So in the sake category, they're huge. And then I have a question. Are you able to answer questions like, if I wanted to know what percentage of supermarkets regionally or across the US carry some kind of kombucha, any kind of kombucha? Is that a kind of question that Spins could answer?
Yeah, so I'll take those in chunks. So first thing I'll start with is your point on Danone. Just quick clarification. I know Danone segments are broken out, or Dannon segments are broken out by kind of product line. And so what you may be seeing is some of the unbundling of all those different products. And so I want to make that clarification. We'd have to roll that up to kind of validate that point. And then the other kind of plug I'll put in for kimchi is every year we have a group of friends that we rent a house in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. And at the local Piggly Wiggly, they had a whole set of kimchi. So to your point around scale, I'm like, if it's in the local Piggly Wiggly in Wisconsin, it's definitely prime time for kimchi. And to your third point, yes, we can absolutely answer those cross-channel questions around kind of penetration of sales. And you'll see for a lot of these spaces with significant growth, one of the big drivers or the next avenue for growth for these brands will be distribution. And so we partner with a lot of really great brands to help them figure out who the right retailers are to partner with as they scale.
Great, thank you so much. I guess, Amelia, we have some questions that have come in. I'll turn it over to you. I'll stay here in case there's anything I can speak to.
Yes, thank you, Perteet. That was wonderful, so informative. Okay, I'm curious that we had quite a few questions that are interested in some further analysis from you on some of these trends. So we've seen, as the pandemic has gone on, a big interest in home fermentation and DIYers. You know, everyone's got a sourdough starter in their fridge these days, it seems. What have you seen with these trends? Do you think home fermentation, as it's grown during the pandemic, will people stick with it, or will they be introduced to fermentation brands they can purchase in the store? Where do you see the future of that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think what's really interesting about the question is whether they stick with it or not. I think it increases awareness of these platforms and commitment to these spaces. And so, you know, I heard a lot of early home brewing stories, primarily from the kind of kombucha crowd, you know. And that has certainly, that activity certainly broadens awareness as folks invest in that space in a different way. And I think encourages them to try brands and see like how it meets their home brew. And so I've seen plenty of sourdough challenges. I was probably responsible for some of those feeds early in the pandemic. We were making bread once or twice a week. And I think that all that activity just builds greater buy-in and commitment for these spaces, which is so great for the industry as a whole.
All right, so flavor versus health claims. What is a bigger driver for the people purchasing products?
Yeah, I think both are important, and the answer to that is going to vary a little bit by category. I will say in these fermented categories that we covered today, taste first is always going to be really important. I think people are going to these categories for a different taste experience. If you can level up with a functional benefit, that's fantastic. But I think we have to kind of balance the taste first. So if it's highly functional but doesn't taste good, it won't have the same success, and that's been proven out in many different brands in the category.
So fascinating that kimchi is experiencing such a huge growth in in both natural and MULO channels. Tell me, what do you think is driving kimchi's growth?
I mean, I think there's just broader awareness of fermented products overall. I think it's also an incredibly versatile product. And so the fact that, you can use it, like my husband puts it on his hot dogs, like I think anything that you can find kind of multiple uses beyond kind of the core application creates new growth avenues. And so I think the versatility has really opened up both awareness and excitement for that space.
Yeah.
I'll add on kimchi, like anyone who's made kimchi, it takes a lot and it makes a big mess, and you get the red pepper powder stuck under your fingernails and the onions get in your eyes. And so like I can make kimchi, and then once I've made kimchi, I'm like, okay, next time maybe I'll just buy it, because that's a lot. I think making fermented foods, and I think you mentioned this, Perteet, the more people make fermented foods, maybe the more they appreciate what's available now in the store that really didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, agreed, Alex. I know I have so many sourdough starters in my fridge, but so much easier to go buy my favorite brand at the bakery. All right, so, it was just a few years ago when we saw, Whole Foods expanded their refrigerated section so they could make room for these great, refrigerated kimchis and krauts and pickles. Over the past few years, I'm noticing more traditional grocery stores also expanding their refrigerated section. When do you think fermented foods will become a well-established category in the standard supermarket?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's going to be different. So like we talked about yogurt, yogurt is all the way there. I think you have some of these like sauces and parts of fermented vegetables, like the pickle space in particular, already there. I think as you think about the emerging spaces, I think it depends by like appeal of or broad application of the product, right? And so I always say not every retailer is for every brand. I think you have to find kind of a ceiling that is like the aspiration should not always be to be in every single retail door, because that might not be where your consumers are. So I think a big part of that is understanding like what is the ceiling for the consumers you're trying to reach, and then how do you make sure you're in all of those doors. And that's going to be a little bit different based on the category that you're competing in. But that's also something that Spins is always happy to help brands work through. Like, what is the market potential for your brand?
Yes. Okay, interesting to also see that some, flavors of fermented drinks are experiencing a declined growth, like, the vinegars, the drinking vinegars. What do you think are the next fermented beverage trends? What are you seeing in that data?
Yeah, beverage is really interesting because it's such a hotbed of innovation. There's always kind of something new and interesting, kind of disrupting that 12 to 16 foot set. And so I think what you're seeing now in beverage is a broader kind of level up beyond broader benefit layer around probiotic and kind of gut health as the kind of evolution of that space. And so you're seeing some brands kind of come into the space. So like I think on Olipop is a good example, right? Where it's fermented adjacent, but not fermented exactly, but it's bringing that fiber benefit to the space. And so I think I'd encourage beverage brands to look at that space more broadly, like look at it beyond just what is happening in fermented beverages, but what are the need states that all of these beverages are bringing to the table, and how do you think about that?
Okay, another question from an audience member. You mentioned how kombucha sales are starting to slow. They were very popular, starting to slow, although they are still a huge driver, especially in the natural industry. What do you foresee for potential shifts in the kombucha market? What do you think has stimulated this slowdown? How do you think the pandemic encouraged growth?
Yeah, so I think that's another segment that is the definition or the need state is going to get a little bit broader. And I think you're even seeing that with some of the kind of core kombucha brands that are driving a lot of growth. So I mean, some of that is not coming from kind of that refrigerated set anymore. Like they're starting to pop into shelf stable and find really new ways to grow their brands. And so I think that trend will continue in this space. So really looking at like that broader benefit, I think helps brands stay ahead there.
Yeah. Okay, another question from an audience member on shelf stable fermented products. Do you think that market is sustainable? Especially how to make an authentic shelf stable product that is probably pasteurized and may not have the live cultures. Is that a sustainable market?
Yeah, I think it's I think to the earlier point, I think understanding like what is a consumer need that you're serving and really being true to that. And so if the consumer is coming into the category for those live cultures, then shelf stable may not cut it. But if they're coming in for just a different flavor experience and you can deliver that in a shelf stable format, then why not? Yeah, I think the one consideration in shelf stable is like generally folks are looking for like clean labels. So just because you make the call to go into shelf stable because there's a consumer taste opportunity, et cetera, like I think you just have to be true to your brand tenets and do it in a way that's thoughtful and consistent with what you're offering as a brand.
All right, we had a lot of questions, people have on what to do next. A lot of new brands coming in, digesting this information. Now they want to know how to stay on top of the trends. What is your, I guess, best piece of advice to a new brand digesting these trends? Where to go now?
Yeah, I mean, the market is changing rapidly. So I think the first part is understanding kind of the market landscape and how to navigate that and kind of peek at that on a regular basis. And, Spence helps a lot of emerging brands in that way. We've got a ton of packages that don't break the bank, but allow brands access to some of these insights to really help them stay on top of the market. It's really hard to determine where you go next with your business if you don't know what's happening today. And so that would be kind of the first piece of advice I'd give to brands. But I think the other piece is, as evidenced in a lot of these fast growing categories, the market is shifting in the positive direction, that now more than ever, I think with people being homebound, they're looking for small ways to have different experiences. And so kind of tapping into that where you're having good momentum can be a big growth accelerator.
Yeah. And does Spins track SKUs at like on-premise or restaurant sales, like places selling beer or kombucha doing that?
We do not track the on-premise portion of those sales.
Okay. What do you see, I guess, what's your projection for the next 5 years in the industry? Where do you see the future of fermentation?
I'm super excited to see where the market goes. It was fun to dig into the segments in this way with this kind of combined view, because I think there are some interesting shifts happening. And so What I think will be most interesting to see is we're already seeing some of the like legacy segments start to get disrupted by kind of new innovation. And so I'm excited to see the evolution of that innovation and where that goes and kind of what opportunities peak out of that. And so I think sauces was a really good example where you've got like a ton of really exciting growth in this space. And I think this is also a space where like one boat rises many. I don't think that's the same, but you guys get what I mean in that all boats rise, right? And so I think if we can create awareness and excitement about this space and adoption for these kind of different taste profiles. Yes, rising tides float all boats. Thank you, Christy. I think that creates opportunity for like more brands to come in with new propositions. So I think what is in store for this space is that we will see some disruption. We're seeing it already in some interesting innovation coming out of these small segments that I project will get much, much bigger.
I have another question for you, Perteet, if I can break in. How do the categories get determined, and what's the process by which they get changed, either as new things come in or as it makes sense to break things out when they become bigger, or if it makes sense to move them from one place to another? Like, what's the process by which Spins manages that?
Yeah, so we have a team of about 75 folks. Most of them are Chicago-based, our product intelligence team. And they're taking all the UPCs that come into the market and looking at things like channel distribution, product benefits, other product attributes, and kind of categorizing them. There are some spaces that that kind of land in a space and then kind of break out once they get to scale. And so, I think the challenge, so I think shelf stable kombucha is a good one, right? Where like was not a category really until this year. So that still lives with our kind of refrigerated kombucha category. Now we can break it out by shelf stable versus refrigerated. But a key benefit to our brands is making sure you have like meaningful competitive market to compare against, right? So if I'm the disruptor in the shelf stable kombucha space and it's just my brand, I don't want to like buy that category and then only see my performance. And so the categories have to get to some meaningful scale to be able to break out so that you have a true market. And we've got statisticians on staff and all of that to kind of make those determinations of kind of what point that happens at. And
if we had suggestions for new category breakouts, like hard kombucha I've mentioned, is that something that Spins could accommodate in the future?
Yeah, one of the things we pride ourselves on is kind of being ahead of the curve in attributes. So we actually just launched in P3 of this year, a kind of product type. So it's not its own category yet, but within beer, we can see hard kombuchas. And so it's important to us that we give emerging brands that are in disruptive spaces a platform to see their performance. And so that's always something that we're willing to partner on.
And are there any big mass market retailers that are difficult to get numbers from? Like, I've heard that some of the bigger outlets are very private with their numbers. Is there a way to estimate them, or I don't know?
Yeah, we track a majority of the marketplace, or at least project for a majority of the marketplace. There are a handful of retailers that just don't share their data. So like a Trader Joe's or an Aldi would be good examples of that space. And today, you could always use kind of proxy accounts to back into an estimation, but beyond that, we're not able to size those retailers. The good thing is they're just a handful of retailers. And so with the right partnerships, that becomes a little bit easier to do.
And I know I asked you about this earlier, in terms of the natural food space, you all are the leaders in this kind of data and analytics, right?
Yeah, I think we've really evolved from being, like I said, we've been around 25 years. And date myself, but I started using spins back in 2005. And at that point, we were kind of like the natural channel people. Our capabilities have evolved tremendously since that time. And so we really are the voice of health and wellness for the industry. So beyond natural retailers, we have a lot of conventional retail partners who are leaning on us to inform their assortments and kind of the standard of identity for health and wellness broadly. And so I encourage folks as they have questions. I know my email is in the presentation. Please reach out as you have any questions.
Thank you.
Perteet, my last question for you. I know you have to get going. You mentioned earlier that it's exciting to see some of these legacy brands are being disrupted. Do you see a bigger opportunity for regional or local brands to make a bigger impact?
Absolutely. I think even as you look at a category like kombucha, a lot of the big growers came from kind of regional propositions. I think we've seen kind of craft beers and other space that has had a lot of success with kind of those regional brands. I think people are looking to connect with their food and the story behind where their food comes from, and regional brands are uniquely positioned to do that. Now I've seen, big brands create similar connections. And so that doesn't mean you have to be regional to be successful. It just means that people are looking for brands with stories that drive meaningful connections, and regional brands have a little bit of a leg up in their ability to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Perteet, for sharing I know you've been drilling into this data for quite a few weeks now, so thank you so much for joining us. You as well, Alex. Thanks for being one of our hosts today, and thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. We will post a recording on TFA's website in the next 24 hours. We also have a number of great webinars coming up in the next few weeks, including inline monitoring of wine fermentation and global fermentation today and tomorrow. Please go to fermentationassociation.org to check these out and register. And while you're there, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Bye.